light fell over the hills of ancient Jerusalem, like molten fire. The wind carried the scent of cedar and burning clay. From the distance, a mountain shimmered, not with snow but with gold. At its summit, thousands of men moved in silence, their shadows crawling across stone, like ghosts of devotion. 30 meters high, walls lined with cedar from Lebanon, columns of bronze each taller than 2 men standing one upon another. 27 tons of pure gold covering the inner chambers. The Grand Temple of Solomon, the greatest architectural miracle the ancient world ever saw, was not built by chance. It was built by hands that bled, by hearts that feared God, and by minds that refused to accept the limits of human strength. So the people watching from the valleys, it looked divine, an impossible palace of light. But inside the dust, between ropes and stones, the air trembled with pain, heat, and faith. No one dared to speak above a whisper, for this was not just a construction site, it was sacred ground. Before the first stone was ever touched, there was a man standing alone on Mount Moriah, Solomon, the son of David. He looked toward the sky and made a vow. He would build a house worthy of the God of Israel, a dwelling for the presence of the Creator himself, a temple of perfection, not for men, but for eternity. He called his scribes, his architects, his commanders. He spoke not of power or empire, but of precision, harmony, and holiness. The dream spread like fire, from Tyre to the deserts beyond the Jordan. Word traveled that the king of Israel would raise a structure to touch heaven. But the task demanded more than gold and faith. It required the impossible, stones so vast that even imagining their movement defied reason. Wood so sacred that it had to be carried across seas and mountains. And above all, a rule that made the work harder than any before it. No iron tool could be heard upon the holy mountain. The temple had to rise in silence. No hammers ring, no echo of chisels, no cry of command. Only the breath of men, the creak of ropes, the hum of effort. What Solomon asked for was not merely construction. It was obedience shaped into architecture. And so began the gathering. 150,000 men divided by duty, 70,000 to pull, 80,000 to carve, 3,300 to oversee. From dawn to dusk, the mountains echoed with prayer and sweat. They did not build for wages alone. They built for the glory of a promise. Far from Jerusalem, deep in the white hills near Mizpah, the quarries awakened. The sun had barely risen when the cutters struck their first marks on the limestone cliffs. Their task was madness. Carve and move stones weighing over 400 tons, each larger than a modern house. There were no cranes, no pulleys, no wheels strong enough. Only men, wood and willpower. They drew thin black lines across the mountain face, using stones harder than the rock itself. Every mark meant life or death. One wrong cut, and the mountain could collapse, burying dozens. Then they drilled small holes along the lines, and drove dry cedar wedges into each one. Water was poured slowly, trickling into the cracks. As the wood drank, it swelled. Hours passed. Then came the first groan, a deep, low sound, like the breath of the earth itself. A crack spread across the limestone, wider, deeper, until the mountain split open exactly where they had drawn their marks. No explosion, no sound of iron, just the soft sigh of stones surrendering to human patience. When the rock finally broke free, men cheered quietly, not because it was easy, but because it worked. Each block had to be perfect, each surface measured by eye and hand. One mistake, and months of labor turned to dust. The air in the quarries was thick with chalk and sweat. Sunlight stabbed through clouds of dust. Men wore no armor, no sandals, only rags and scars. If a block slipped, it crushed whatever lay beneath. There were no doctors, no rescue, Death came silently, like the mountain itself. And yet, they returned every morning, because the king's word had become a command from heaven. They carved, shaped, polished, until the rock gleamed like ivory. Then, with ropes thicker than a man's leg, they began to move the unmovable. The ground trembled. Voices rose in rhythm. Not of song, but of struggle. They pulled together, hundreds at once. Step by step, inch by inch, the first stone of the Grand Temple began its journey toward Jerusalem. There was one rule that separated this work from every monument in history. No hammer could ring. No iron could sing. The mountain where the temple would rise was to remain holy, untouched by the noise of men. Every sound was a sin, every echo a defilement. So, in the quarries far from Mount Moriah, the stones were finished in secret. Every edge measured with cords of flax. Every surface polished until the light slipped off like water. When a stone was complete, the builders carved markings into it. Hebrew letters and sacred symbols, guiding where each block would one day rest in the walls of the house of God. They spoke little. The rhythm of their breathing became the rhythm of work. Even their tools were wrapped in leather to muffle the sound. It was not a construction site anymore. It was a sanctuary of labor, and though the men were exhausted, they knew every silent stroke brought them closer to heaven. When the desert wind swept through the hills, it carried a strange whisper, the breath of the mountains themselves. At dawn, the cutters stood before the cliffs, tracing thin lines where the next stone would fall. No one shouted. No one gave orders. Only eyes spoke. They hammered dry wooden wedges into the slits, poured water and stepped back. The wood drank greedily, swelling inside the stone. Hours passed. The ground shivered, and a deep moan rose from the earth. The sound of the mountain exhaling. Then came the moment of birth. A shudder, a snap, and the block slid free with a sigh that echoed through the valley. Men ran forward with ropes, singing under their breath to keep rhythm. Dust filled the air like incense. The sun cut through it in golden shafts, illuminating faces covered in sweat and chalk. They did not see themselves as laborers. They believed they were midwives of something sacred, delivering the very bones of the earth to become the body of a temple. And yet, with every new stone freed, the toll deepened. Hands blistered, feet split on the hot limestone. Some never rose again after a collapse. The quarry swallowed them without sound. Their names were forgotten, but their stones remained, each one a silent testimony carved into eternity. When the first finished stones reached the edge of the hills, another army took over, 70,000 men, whose task was to move the unmovable. They built ramps of earth compacted with sweat and time, stretching for kilometers through valleys and ridges. Tree trunks served as rollers. Ropes of twisted palm fibers held the weight of gods. A single block could crush 100 men if the ground gave way. Still they pulled. Their chants rolled like thunder through the canyon. 1, 2, pull, stop. 1, 2, pull, stop. Every breath timed with the heartbeat of the stone. The ropes strained, groaning like beasts under the sun. Fibers snapped, then were replaced again. Every meter gained was a victory. Every slip, a funeral. The Israelites worked in shifts, 1 month of labor, 2 months home. They bore the burden with pride, knowing their hands served the king and their souls served God. But beside them were men with no freedom at all. The Canaanites, enslaved to the mountain. They had no breaks, no promises, no names recorded in scripture. For them, the road to Jerusalem was a road of bones. Sometimes at dusk, when the air cooled and the chanting stopped, the overseers would let the men rest. They lay beside the stone they had moved that day, staring up at the same sky their ancestors once prayed beneath. In that silence, they felt both pride and terror. Pride that they had conquered nature, and terror that tomorrow they would have to do it again. When the first massive block finally reached Mount Moriah, the crowd watching wept. For 7 days it had crawled over mountains and valleys pulled by human hands alone. And yet, it arrived intact, smooth, unbroken, glowing under the sunset like a piece of heaven itself. By the 3rd year, the work had turned into a ritual of pain. The stones grew larger, the roads longer, the air heavier, and still the rule of silence remained. One day, under the blazing desert sun, a rope snapped. The sound was like thunder. The stone jerked backward, crushing 6 men where they stood. Their screams were swallowed by the dust before reaching the sky. The foreman closed his eyes, muttered a short prayer, and gave the order, "Pull again." There was no warning, no pause. The dead were carried aside, covered with the same dust they had raised, and the work went on. For those who labored under Solomon's banner, death had become part of the rhythm, one more beat in the march toward a divine promise. For the Israelites, it was work rewarded by rest. For the slaves, it was obedience or death. 1 Kings 9:21 recorded it without emotion. Solomon made them serve as forced laborers. Each sunrise looked the same. Men rising from sleep on cold ground, their bodies trembling from exhaustion, their minds empty except for one command: move the stone forward. And yet, in that brutal silence, there was a strange peace. They believed that the temple would make them eternal, that God Himself would see their suffering and remember their names. Every drop of sweat, every crushed bone, every silent death, all offered to heaven as sacrifice. They were not just building walls. They were building a covenant. Far north, beyond the borders of Israel, the mountains of Lebanon rose like green fortresses. The air there was thick with the smell of resin and rain. Among those forests stood the trees Solomon desired most, the cedars of God, ancient and eternal. Solomon could not cut them himself, so he forged a pact with Hiram, king of Tyre. The terms were costly: 20,000 measures of wheat, 20,000 of pure oil, paid each year. But Solomon agreed, for without cedar there could be no temple. 10,000 men of Israel were sent to Lebanon. They worked beside Sidonian lumberjacks, men who knew how to speak to trees. Each cedar was a giant older than any living king. To fell one was not work, it was ceremony. At dawn, the men prayed. Axes bit deep into bark that smelled of heaven. The forest echoed with low groans, as if mourning its own sacrifice. When the trunk finally cracked, it fell with a roar that shook the valley. The air filled with cedar dust, fragrant, golden, holy. Then came the impossible task of transport. Logs heavier than bronze pillars were tied together with rope and floated on the sea rafts, guided by smaller boats. Waves battered them, winds tore the ropes, storms devoured many. But still they drifted south toward Joppa, the port that would deliver them to the heart of Israel. From Joppa to Jerusalem, 60 kilometers of agony awaited. The logs were placed on rollers, pulled by hundreds of men. Cedar cracked under pressure. The slightest mistake could ruin a piece worth more than gold. Men slept on the roadside, ate bread hard as stone, and drank water from clay jars that tasted of earth. They walked beside the same wood they would later polish, shape, and raise into the ceilings of the temple. By the time the last raft arrived, many of those who cut the first trees were gone, buried in foreign soil, remembered only by the smell of the forest that outlived them. And yet, when the cedar entered Jerusalem, the city changed. Its air carried a new fragrance, of rain, of blood, of faith. The wood from another world had reached the mountain of God. By the 4th year, Mount Moriah no longer looked like a hill. It looked like the skeleton of heaven. Rows of colossal stones stood shoulder to shoulder, rising toward the sky. Cedar beams stretched across them, carved and fitted with divine precision. Every surface gleamed under the sun, every angle aligned as though guided by invisible hand. The temple was being built in silence, but its presence thundered across the land. People from miles away came to see what words could not describe. A city within a city, a fortress of faith without sound. The builders moved like priests, not workers. Every stone that fit perfectly was greeted not with applause but with bowed heads. They believed the silence itself was holy, that God was listening to the rhythm of their breath, not the clatter of their tools. If a stone was off by even a finger's width, it was pulled out and replaced, not by hammers but by sheer will. Wooden levers groaned, ropes strained. The ground shook as each piece settled into eternity. At night, torches burned around the mountain, their light flickering across faces carved by hardship. They ate little, spoke less, but as they watched the structure rise, they felt it. The sense that they were part of something beyond life, something that would outlast time itself. When the final layer of foundation was laid, the foremen stood together at the edge of the platform. The wind swept across the city, carrying dust and gold together in the same breath. Below them, the streets of Jerusalem glowed in the twilight. Above them, the first outlines of God's house touched the stars. The silent city was no longer a dream. It was real, and it was growing. When the stones stood tall and the cedar beams were raised, Solomon turned his eyes toward the final element. Not sunlight, but living light, forged from metal, born from flame. 27 tons of pure gold waited in sealed chambers beneath the Temple Mount. It had been collected from tributes, trade routes, and gifts from distant kings. Now it was time to awaken it. Furnaces roared across the valley, glowing like small suns under the night sky. Men worked in shifts, their bodies soaked in sweat, their faces smeared with soot and oil. Inside each furnace, gold melted like honey, thick, radiant, and alive. They poured it into clay molds, shaped it into plates, and hammered each sheet upon the cedar walls. The sound of the forge echoed like a heartbeat, steady, sacred. Sparks flew like stars, bouncing off the ground, clinging to skin, burning holes into clothes. Some men collapsed from the heat. Others fainted from the smoke. Still, they rose again, for this was no ordinary labor. This was a ritual of transformation. Piece by piece, the inner sanctuary began to shimmer. Walls of gold, ceilings of gold. Even the floor reflected light, like liquid fire. The smell of burning oil, sweat, and incense merged into a single perfume. The scent of creation. And when the last plate was nailed upon the cedar, the chamber blazed so brightly that no lamp was needed. The temple no longer reflected light. It created it. In the midst of this inferno stood a man unlike any other. His name was Hiram of Tyre, a craftsman born of two worlds. His mother, an Israelite widow from Naphtali. His father, a Phoenician metalworker from the port city of Tyre. He had the strength of a soldier, the patience of a priest, and the mind of an engineer centuries ahead of his time. Solomon himself sent for him. Scripture says he was filled with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge to work all manner of bronze. When Hiram arrived in Jerusalem, he carried no army, only his tools and the fire in his eyes. He looked at the half-built temple and saw what others could not. A house not made of stone, but of harmony, where earth, air, fire, and water would meet. Under his command, the bronze furnaces blazed day and night. The sound of hammers filled the air like thunder. Men poured molten metal into molds, taller than themselves. The ground shook with every cast. And yet, amid the chaos, Hiram moved like a conductor before an orchestra. Calm, precise, relentless. He taught the workers to treat metal as living flesh, to listen when it hissed, to wait when it breathed. They watched as bronze flowed like rivers, forming shapes no man had ever seen. One by one, he birthed the sacred objects of the temple. the golden lampstands, the altar of incense, the basins for purification. Each piece was perfect, not by measurement, but by faith. When asked how he achieved such precision, he simply said, "I listened to the fire." Then came his greatest challenge. 2 pillars, enormous, unthinkable, to stand before the entrance of the holy house. They would mark the threshold between the world of men and the world of God. Each one, 8 meters tall, so wide that 3 men could barely encircle it. They were named Jachin and Boaz. He shall establish, and in him is strength. For months, the furnaces blazed without pause. The valley glowed red every night as molten bronze was poured into colossal molds. The smell of burning clay and oil filled the air. When the castings cooled, Hiram ordered the molds broken open. From the smoke rose the 2 pillars. Smooth, shining, flawless. Men fell to their knees at the sight. They had never seen metal alive before. Metal that breathed light. At dawn, the pillars were hauled up the mountain by hundreds of men. Ropes groaning, dust swirling. The sound of their movement echoed through the city like thunder rolling over stone. As they were lifted into place, the sun struck them, and for the first time, Jerusalem shone like the reflection of heaven. Every surface gleamed, every sound stilled. It was said that even the air around the temple grew warmer, as if the mountain itself began to burn with divine fire. When the second pillar finally locked into its base, the workers dropped their ropes and stepped back. The foreman did not speak. Even Solomon, watching from the terrace, remained silent. For before them stood the entrance to eternity. Bronze and gold, stone and cedar, earth and light, all fused together in perfect balance. The house of the Lord was almost complete. 7 years had passed, 2,555 days of dust, fire, blood, and devotion. The air around Mount Moriah had changed. It no longer smelled of sweat and earth. It smelled of cedar, incense, and faith. 150,000 men had lived and died for a dream that only one man had spoken aloud. They had pulled stones heavier than houses. They had carried wood across mountains and seas. They had burned gold until the air shimmered. Now at last the final block waited. At sunrise, the trumpets of the priests sounded across the valley. Men gathered along the terraces, their faces dark with soot and time. Solomon stood in white robes, the morning light catching the golden crown upon his head. He raised his hand, and silence fell. Deeper than before, the last stone rose. Ropes strained. Voices hummed in rhythm, slow and steady as if the mountain itself were breathing. When the block settled into place, the sound it made was not of stone meeting stone. It was like the closing of a heartbeat, the sealing of a covenant. The temple was complete, from its foundation to its golden roof. It stood like a mountain of light in the heart of Jerusalem. No palace, no empire, no army had ever built such a thing. It was not just a monument. It was a miracle made visible. That night the men did not work. For the first time in 7 years they slept without fear. Some beside the walls they had raised, others beneath the open sky. They had given everything. And finally, it was done. The morning of dedication came with a sky of silver clouds. All of Israel gathered before the temple, kings, elders, priests, and children. Trumpets shone in the sun, the air heavy with the scent of burning incense. At the center stood Solomon. Before him, the Ark of the Covenant, carried by priests dressed in white linen. They moved slowly, their feet dusting the golden floor. Behind them, the people watched in silence, the breath of thousands held in reverence. The Ark was set within the inner chamber, the Holy of Holies. And when Solomon knelt, spreading his hands toward heaven, his voice trembled with prayer. He asked not for power nor victory, but for presence, that God himself would dwell among his people. As his final words faded into the wind, the sky darkened. A low hum rolled across the city, deep as thunder. Then it came, a cloud, thick and luminous, descending upon the temple. It poured through the doors, through the windows, through every crack in the golden walls. It was not smoke. It was glory. The air turned bright and heavy. Priests staggered, unable to stand. Some wept. Others fell to their knees as light filled every corner, wrapping stone and gold in living fire. Scripture says they could not remain to minister, for the presence of the Lord had filled the house. And in that moment, everything stopped. No voice, no tool, no movement. Only the heartbeat of heaven inside the walls that men had built. The dream of Solomon had become real. The impossible temple had found its soul. When the glory lifted and the cloud faded, the temple remained, shining like a sun upon the mountain. For generations it stood as the heart of Israel, a place where prayers became fire and silence became language. But time does not bow, not even to gold. Centuries later, the same walls that once shimmered with divine light would echo with screams and smoke. The pillars would fall, the gold would melt, the ark would vanish. The grand temple of Solomon, the most perfect creation of the ancient world, would become the greatest mystery of all time. Yet even in ruin, it did not die. Every stone, every cedar beam, every flake of gold carried the memory of those who gave everything to build it. The slaves, the craftsmen, the overseers, the dreamers, their names erased from record, but written in eternity. For though the temple was made of stone, it was never just stone. It was faith carved into the bones of the earth. It was human effort reaching for something divine. And as the sun set over the ruins centuries later, the light still lingered, a whisper that refused to fade. The house was gone, but the presence remained. Because what Solomon built was more than a building. It was proof that man could touch heaven, even if only for a moment. Now the mountain stands silent once more, but its story has not ended.